CO2 more quickly. But whoa, here is yet another way to get rid of those excess hydrogen ions. You can actually move those hydrogen ions into your cells. And in exchange for them, notice what happens. Potassium ions move out of the cell. So it's kind of an exchange reaction here where we move hydrogens in, potassium out. Hey, if you get rid of your hydrogens by hiding them inside cells, what have you just done for your blood pH? Good. Balanced it back up where it should be. And you get rid of those excess hydrogens just by putting them in the closet, so to speak. Slam those hydrogens into your cells in exchange for the potassium ions. So in a case where a person is in acidosis, we not only have kidneys to compensate, lungs to compensate, now we have a cellular process that compensates to get those excess hydrogens out of the bloodstream. Let's talk about the flip side of the coin, because if you've got a person who's in alkalosis, let's say this is a person who perhaps had a bunch of Tums, has really made their bloodstream alkaline, and currently they're sending their blood pH above 7.45. Let me come down here and not mess up our picture. Now, what do you do with those hydrogen ions? Take them out. Any hydrogens that you might have had stored in those cells will now come out to the bloodstream, because we want to take that blood pH and drop it into the more acidic range, so to speak. So we want to get that blood pH at least back down to 7.45. How do you do that? Add acid, right? But what you do is you exchange the hydrogens out, you bring potassiums in. So potassiums and hydrogens can exchange back and forth when a person is in alkalosis or in acidosis. If you take this a step further and you think about diabetics, diabetics are often flirting with that range of being in ketoacidosis. So you can see with the case of ketoacidosis, those hydrogen ions are going into their blood, or from their bloodstream into their cells for hiding, right? Where does that potassium end up? Outside the cell. And if it happens to end up in the bloodstream, then a person can actually lose potassium from the bloodstream. Okay, so this answers the question for us. Back when we talked about, say, hypokalemia, low potassium levels, we mentioned that certain diabetic medications actually make people lose potassium ions. So you can see here's the basis for how that medication must work. It must store hydrogens in cells in exchange for potassiums coming out, and the person loses those potassiums instead. I guess the trade-off here is you maintain proper blood pressure, but of course the trade-off is you also lose those potassiums in the urine. So kind of an interesting concept here in terms of how to use potassiums and hydrogens to maintain blood pH. All right, let's see. We've talked a little bit in the past about these two terms, so I want to mention them to you one more time. Again, we're looking for the bolded terms here. Aldosterone can regulate potassium levels, so of course, like with the past two ions, if you have low potassium, you have hypokalemia. Excess calcium could be hyperkalemia. Sorry, sodium, I'm saying calcium, in other words. Excess potassium should be hyperkalemia. Notice the backwardness here of the situation. When we talked about sodium and chlorine, we said that if you have excess aldosterone, you would retain more sodium, right? Now, look at this case. If you have excess aldosterone, you're not keeping potassium. Where is it going?
Out in the urine.
Out in the urine, exactly. Because if you have excess aldosterone at the DCT, you're retaining sodium in exchange for dumping out potassium. So you can see in the case of excess aldosterone, that actually sends you into a case of hypokalemia. Keep in mind, aldosterone causes sodium retention, but loss of potassium. You can see the flip side of the coin here for hyperkalemia. In this case, you may not have enough aldosterone So you're retaining too much of that potassium. And last but not least on your list here is calcium. Calcium obviously not regulated by aldosterone, so it's the odd man out here. But this one is the most abundant ion in the body altogether. This beats sodium, this beats calcium, or sorry, this beats chlorine, this beats potassium. So calcium, because it is a major ion in the bones, is actually the most common ion in our body. You might recall from previous chapter 16, we've talked about two hormones that regulate this calcium levels in the bloodstream. In addition to PTH and calcitonin, we've also talked back in Bio 210 about another hormone. This is the one that regulates vitamin D. Do you recall the name of that one? Not parathyroid, it starts with a C. Kind of sounds like calcitriol, yeah. Calcitriol does also help to regulate calcium levels.
We need to know the regulated stuff.
I would just know PTH, calcitonin. You might want to add calcitriol too for that one. Just a good reminder for you. Or what you say?
That would be it.
Okay.
When it regulates it, you mean it raises or lowers?
Either
Both.
one, yeah. Since we're talking PTH and calcitriol, that raises, and calcitonin lowers. The hormone with the biggest influence here is PTH. So PTH has the biggest influence over blood calcium levels. So if you have too little PTH, PTH does not destroy bones or promote the reabsorption from the intestines or from the kidney. So that may result in hypocalcemia. Whereas too much PTH can actually promote hypercalcemia. Hey, if you're breastfeeding, this is a case for you, right? Because if a person is breastfeeding, that calcium needs to leave the body in the breast milk. So PTH actually will promote hypercalcemia, but of course it's leaving the body, so the bones and everything start to deteriorate during that time period of breastfeeding. After a person stops breastfeeding, then of course the body naturally deposits back that calcium, but that's a case where you may have excess PTH promoting hypercalcemia. Alright, so just want to hit the highlights there for you in preparation for taking you to the next page. Y'all have questions so far? How do you feel about osmosis from Bio 210? Do it in your sleep? Are you like 100% comfortable with osmosis, or could you use a little bit of a review? Review. Okay. What we're doing today is we're going to take, filtration reabsorption and couple it with osmosis. So you've got to feel comfortable with both concepts here to really get the stuff to click. First off, intracellular fluid is what we have in the cell. And what I'm doing is I'm just plucking a cell, putting it into a solution, and we're going to watch what happens to that cell in solution. Okay, likewise, this could be a cell from the bloodstream, and this could be blood plasma. Doesn't necessarily matter where the cell came from. What we're going to do right now is watch what happens to that cell when placed in a different type of solution or a different type of environment. You might think of that solution as extracellular fluid. Hey, extracellular can be interstitial fluid. It can also be blood plasma. So I'm not saying which one it is right now because it could be either one, but we're just looking at how a cell responds to a different type of solution in its extracellular environment. To be at homeostasis or equilibrium, what does the solute concentration have to be? For your cell and same, yeah, isotonic. Just to make this easier on us, I'm going to pick, say, percentages so you can follow the process. I'm just going to pick a number like 1.5% solute concentration. So in terms of inside the cell, what types of ions are in there? Potassium.
Sodium.
Yes, sodium's on the outside. Magnesium's in there. Phosphate's inside. So we've got a lot of ions inside that help to maintain that osmotic situation. On the outside, we have things like sodium, perhaps calcium, bicarbonates out there. So we've got ions on the outside that are creating osmosis and pulling the fluid that's battling the fluid inside the cell by a different set of ions in there. So as long as we're at equilibrium with the same solute concentration, the net motion of water into or out of the cell remains pretty stable or pretty steady. This is what we're looking for. This is the ideal situation. This is what we would call an isotonic solution. And unfortunately, this is the last time we'll talk about it, because if everything was a nice, pretty isotonic situation, we wouldn't have to bother with fluid electrolyte balance. What we're going to spend time on today and a little bit on Thursday is doing hypotonic and hypertonic solutions. Let's stick with our number of 1.5% for the concentration of solutes inside our cell. This time we're going to talk about a situation where the surrounding fluid is less concentrated.